In the spring of 1915, along the muddy trenches of Flanders fields, men from different nations found themselves caught in the first widespread use of chemical warfare, a weapon that would change the nature of killing forever. This is a story drawn from the pages of history, about a moment when ordinary lives intersected with forces beyond their control, in a time and place where small choices met larger consequences. If stories like this resonate with you, consider subscribing to support more historical narratives that bring forgotten moments back to life. Jakob Brenner woke before dawn on April 22nd to the sound of boots squelching through mud outside his dugout. The air smelled of damp earth and unwashed men, familiar scents he'd grown accustomed to over 8 months at the front. He was 24 years old, a former chemistry student from Munich who'd enlisted with enthusiasm that now felt like it belonged to someone else entirely. His hands were steady as he pulled on his boots, laced them tight, checked the contents of his pack. Everything in order, everything as it should be. The officers had been tense for 3 days, whispering in corners, studying weather reports with unusual intensity. Jakob had seen the special canisters being positioned along their section of the trench, large metal cylinders painted field gray, handles marked with warnings in red paint. He knew what they contained. His education had given him enough knowledge to understand the chemical process, the way chlorine gas would billow and sink, heavier than air, seeking the lowest ground. The trenches, the enemy positions dug into Belgian soil across no man's land. He climbed out of the dugout as the sky shifted from black to deep blue. Other men were emerging too, moving quietly, their breath visible in the cold morning air. Spring in Flanders meant mud and rain, and temperatures that never quite warmed until midday. Jakob found his position along the firing step, nodded to the men on either side. Friedrich, a baker from Hamburg, Otto, who'd worked in his father's printing shop. Boys, really, though the war had aged them all beyond their years. Across the channel, in a field hospital 3 miles behind British lines, Henri Duval was ending a night shift that had lasted 14 hours. He was 31, a medic from Lyon who'd volunteered in the war's early months with idealistic notions of saving lives. Those notions had been ground down by reality, by the endless stream of shattered men, by the inadequacy of his supplies, by the knowledge that most of what he did was merely easing passage rather than preventing it. He washed his hands in a basin of cold water, the soap barely making suds. Dawn was breaking, pale light filtering through the canvas tent walls. The cots around him held 20 men in various stages of dying or recovering. Their breathing created a rhythm he'd learned to read. Shallow gasps meant pneumonia, rattling breaths meant fluid in the lungs. The occasional moan meant someone was surfacing from morphine sleep into pain. Henri stepped outside to smoke a cigarette he'd been saving. The tobacco was stale, but it masked other smells. In the distance, perhaps 5 or 6 miles away, he could see the faint line where their trenches faced the German positions. The front line. That narrow strip of contested earth where men lived like rats and died like animals. He'd been called up to the advanced aid stations twice, close enough to hear the machine guns, close enough to feel the ground shake from artillery. He dreaded those calls. Dreaded the ambulance ride forward, the triage decisions, the boys screaming for their mothers. The wind was picking up from the east. Henri noticed it automatically, the way anyone who'd spent time near the front learned to notice wind direction. East meant blowing toward German lines. West meant blowing toward theirs. The morning sky was clear, promising a rare day without rain. In a command bunker 6 feet underground, Captain William Cross studied maps by lantern light. He was 38, older than most officers at his rank, a career soldier who'd served in India before the war. His mustache was neatly trimmed despite the conditions, a small vanity he maintained as a reminder of civilization. He'd been given orders 2 days ago that still sat uneasily in his mind. The attack would begin at dawn. Chemical weapons, a new element in warfare, controversial even among the high command. Cross had read the technical specifications, understood the theory. Wind from the east would carry chlorine gas toward French and Canadian positions in the Ypres salient. The gas would disable or kill enemy troops, allowing German infantry to advance with minimal resistance. A breakthrough. Perhaps even an end to the stalemate that had turned Belgium into an endless graveyard. But Cross had also read medical reports from smaller tests. He knew what chlorine did to human lungs, knew that men would drown in their own fluids, suffocating slowly, clawing at their throats. It wasn't a clean death, wasn't the kind of death that soldiers expected, even in this brutal war. There was something about poison gas that felt wrong, in a way that bullets and shells somehow didn't, though Cross couldn't quite articulate why. He checked his watch. 5 o'clock. In the trenches above, his men would be preparing, checking gas masks, primitive canvas affairs that offered limited protection, positioning themselves for the advance that would follow the gas release. Cross had given the orders clearly, professionally. He would see them through with the same professionalism. That was what leadership required. Peter Kowalski couldn't sleep. The Polish volunteer had been assigned to a mixed unit, French and British troops working alongside a handful of colonials and volunteers from occupied territories. At 27, he was fighting for a free Poland that existed only as an idea, serving with men whose languages he barely spoke. His gift for translation had made him valuable, had kept him alive when others died. But tonight, this morning, something felt different. He sat in the trench with his back against sandbags, writing a letter he suspected he'd never send. The paper was damp, the pencil stub worn nearly to nothing. He wrote in Polish, knowing his mother wouldn't receive it, knowing the censors would likely confiscate anything that hinted at operations. But the act of writing steadied him, gave him something to do with his hands while waiting for whatever came next. Around him, men spoke in low voices, French, English, a few words of Flemish from local guides, the babble of war. Peter had learned to recognize anxiety in any language, the pitch of voices, the nervous laughter, the way men checked and rechecked equipment they had already verified. Something was happening, the officers knew. The enlisted men could only guess and wait. The sky was lighter now. Peter could see the outlines of the trench walls, the duckboards beneath his boots, the faces of men he'd lived beside for months. Jacques, who'd been a schoolteacher. Thomas, a dock worker from Liverpool. Men with families, histories, futures that might end this morning or next week or in 5 minutes. The randomness of survival had stopped bothering Peter months ago. Now he simply existed from moment to moment, grateful for each breath, expecting nothing. At 5 a.m. precisely, German soldiers began opening the valves on 6,000 cylinders, positioned along a 4-mile front. Jakob stood at his post, watching as the first wisps of yellow-green gas emerged, thicker than fog, heavy as water. It poured from the canisters and began flowing across no man's land, a creeping cloud that hugged the earth, seeking the lowest ground, exactly as his chemistry professors had once explained in bright classrooms that seemed impossibly distant now. The wind was steady from the east. Perfect conditions. Jakob could hear officers calling out orders, their voices controlled, professional. Men fixed bayonets. The gas would do its work first, 10 minutes, perhaps 15. Then the infantry would advance through the cleared positions. That was the plan. That was how it was supposed to happen. He watched the yellow cloud drift toward the Allied trenches, growing larger, spreading wider. Behind him, someone was praying in a whisper. Someone else was breathing too fast on the edge of panic. Jakob forced himself to remain calm. He'd studied gas behavior, knew it would dissipate eventually, knew the masks would protect them if the wind shifted. The wind wouldn't shift, not with conditions this stable. The gas reached the Allied lines. Even from this distance, Jakob could hear the sounds that followed, confused shouting, the beginning of screams. He closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them again, the cloud was still spreading, still flowing forward like something alive. Then at 5:04 a.m., the wind changed. It wasn't dramatic, No sudden gust, just a gradual shift in direction, a rotation from east to northwest. The yellow cloud hesitated, seemed to pause in its forward movement. Then it began drifting back, toward the German trenches, toward Jakob's position. Someone shouted a warning. Men scrambled for gas masks, pulling them over faces with shaking hands. Jakob grabbed his own mask, the rubber stiff and cold, the eyepieces already fogging. Through the distorted glass, he watched the gas cloud approaching, watched it spill over the parapet and into the trench where he stood with dozens of other men who'd believed themselves safe, who'd believed the wind would hold steady, who'd believed in plans and calculations and the certainty of science. The first wisps of chlorine reached him. Even through the mask he could smell it, bleach and metal, sharp enough to burn. His eyes began watering. Someone was already choking, mask knocked aside, hands clutching at his throat. Jakob tried to breathe slowly, tried to trust the canvas and rubber keeping him alive. But the gas was everywhere now, pooling in the trench, thicker than any fog, and men were falling, and the screaming had started, and he realized with perfect clarity that the wind had killed them all. At 5 a.m. precisely, German soldiers began opening the valves on 6,000 cylinders positioned along a 4-mile front. Jakob stood at his post, watching as the first wisps of yellow-green gas emerged, thicker than fog, heavy as water. It poured from the canisters and began flowing across no man's land, a creeping cloud that hugged the earth, seeking the lowest ground, exactly as his chemistry professors had once explained in bright classrooms that seemed impossibly distant now. The wind was steady from the east. Perfect conditions. Jakob could hear officers calling out orders, their voices controlled, professional. Men fixed bayonets. The gas would do its work first, 10 minutes, perhaps 15. Then the infantry would advance through the cleared positions. That was the plan. That was how it was supposed to happen. He watched the yellow cloud drift toward the Allied trenches, growing larger, spreading wider. Behind him, someone was praying in a whisper. Someone else was breathing too fast on the edge of panic. Jakob forced himself to remain calm. He'd studied gas behavior, knew it would dissipate eventually, knew the masks would protect them if the wind shifted. The wind wouldn't shift, not with conditions this stable. The gas reached the Allied lines. Even from this distance, Jakob could hear the sounds that followed, confused shouting, the beginning of screams. He closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them again, the cloud was still spreading, still flowing forward like something alive. Then at 5:04 a.m., the wind changed. It wasn't dramatic, no sudden gust, just a gradual shift in direction, a rotation from east to northwest. The yellow cloud hesitated, seemed to pause in its forward movement. Then it began drifting back, toward the German trenches, toward Jakob's position. Someone shouted a warning. Men scrambled for gas masks, pulling them over faces with shaking hands. Jakob grabbed his own mask, the rubber stiff and cold, the eyepieces already fogging. Through the distorted glass, he watched the gas cloud approaching, watched it spill over the parapet and into the trench where he stood with dozens of other men who'd believed themselves safe, who'd believed the wind would hold steady, who'd believed in plans and calculations and the certainty of science. The first wisps of chlorine reached him. Even through the mask he could smell it, bleach and metal, sharp enough to burn. His eyes began watering. Someone was already choking, mask knocked aside, hands clutching at his throat. Jakob tried to breathe slowly, tried to trust the canvas and rubber keeping him alive. But the gas was everywhere now, pooling in the trench, thicker than any fog, and men were falling, and the screaming had started, and he realized with perfect clarity that the wind had killed them all. Jakob's mask saved him for the first 5 minutes. He pressed himself against the trench wall, trying to stay above the worst of the gas that pooled at the bottom like poisoned water. Men around him were tearing at their masks, the instinct to breathe overwhelming the knowledge that removing protection meant death. He watched Friedrich collapse, watched Otto claw at his throat, watched the trench fill with bodies and yellow-green fog. His mask was leaking. He could feel it, could taste the chlorine seeping in around the edges, burning his throat, making his lungs spasm. Jakob tried to adjust it with shaking hands, tried to maintain the seal, but the rubber was cheap, the fit imperfect. Gas warfare was new. The protective equipment was experimental. He was learning these truths in real time as poison entered his body with each breath. Someone stumbled past him, mask gone, hands outstretched, blind. Jakob reached out instinctively, tried to guide the man toward clearer air, but his own vision was blurring. Tears streamed down his face inside the mask. His chest felt tight, constricted, as though iron bands were squeezing his ribs. He could hear himself wheezing, could hear the wet sound in his lungs that meant fluid was accumulating. The officers were shouting evacuation orders, but their voices seemed distant, distorted. Jakob tried to climb out of the trench, tried to reach higher ground where the gas would be thinner, but his legs wouldn't cooperate. He made it 3 steps before falling to his knees. The mask came off. He didn't remember removing it, didn't remember making that choice. But suddenly it was gone, and he was breathing pure chlorine. The pain was extraordinary, like inhaling fire and broken glass, like drowning and burning simultaneously. Jakob's body convulsed, trying to expel the poison, but each cough brought more gas into his lungs. He could feel himself dying, could feel his body shutting down one system at a time. His vision narrowed to a tunnel. His hearing faded to a high, ringing tone. He thought about his mother in Munich, about his chemistry professor who'd written him a letter last month, asking about his experiences. He thought about the yellow cloud and the wind that had changed direction and the calculations that had promised safety. Peter Kowalski saw the gas before he smelled it. The yellow-green cloud came drifting across no man's land, like something from a nightmare, thick and purposeful. Men around him began shouting warnings in 3 languages. Someone screamed to run. Someone else yelled to stay low. No one knew what to do because nothing like this had happened before. Peter had no gas mask. His unit hadn't been issued them, hadn't been considered priority for the limited supply. He grabbed a wet rag someone thrust at him, pressed it over his nose and mouth, and began moving. Not running, because panic would kill him faster than gas, moving deliberately toward the communication trench that led to the rear, keeping low, trying not to breathe deeply. The gas reached the trench just as he turned the corner. He heard it arrive, heard the sudden chorus of choking, heard men screaming in pain and terror. Peter kept moving, kept the wet cloth pressed tight, kept his breathing shallow. His eyes burned. His throat felt raw. But he was still upright, still conscious, still putting distance between himself and the thickest concentration of chlorine. He passed men who'd fallen, men curled on the ground, gasping like fish out of water. Peter didn't stop. Couldn't stop. The guilt would come later, would sit heavy in his chest for whatever remained of his life. But in that moment, survival meant moving forward and not looking back. He emerged from the trench into relatively clear air, collapsed against a ruined wall, and finally allowed himself to gulp in breaths that burned, but didn't kill. Behind him, the screaming continued. French voices, British voices, voices in languages he couldn't identify, all reduced to the same sounds of agony. Peter vomited into the mud, the wet rag falling from his hands. When he looked back toward the trenches, he could see the gas cloud settling like fog into every depression, every hole, every place where men had dug themselves into the earth for protection. Captain Cross received the first reports at 5:15 a.m. The gas release had been executed as planned. Wind conditions had been favorable, everything proceeding according to schedule. Then, at 5:47 a.m., different reports began arriving. The wind had shifted. The gas had turned back toward German positions. Casualties on both sides, requests for medical support, requests for evacuation, requests for orders that Cross didn't have. He stood in the command bunker, the map suddenly useless, the careful planning rendered meaningless by meteorology. Cross had studied warfare his entire adult life, had learned tactics and strategy, had read Clausewitz and Napoleon, had trained to make decisions under pressure. But nothing in his education had prepared him for this, for weapons that could turn against their users, for battles won and lost by wind direction. The reports kept coming. German infantry unable to advance through their own gas, Allied positions evacuated in panic, no man's land filled with dead and dying from both sides. The assault had failed. More than failed, it had created chaos, had killed indiscriminately, had proven that chemical weapons were as dangerous to the users as to the targets. Cross began issuing orders mechanically. Send medical units forward, evacuate the affected trenches, hold defensive positions, all standard procedures, all inadequate to the situation. He thought about the technical specifications he'd read, the promises that gas warfare would break the stalemate. No one had mentioned the possibility of wind changing. No one had planned for the weapons to betray them. An aide brought him updated casualty estimates. Hundreds dead, hundreds more with damaged lungs who would die slowly over the coming days. Cross added the numbers from both sides, German and Allied, and the total made him physically ill. He'd given the order. He'd authorized the gas release. The fact that wind had turned it back toward his own allies didn't absolve him of responsibility for what he'd set in motion. Henri worked through the morning without stopping. The ambulances kept arriving, kept unloading men who were drowning in air. Some were French, some were Canadian. Some wore German uniforms, prisoners or men who'd staggered across no man's land seeking any kind of help. Henri treated them all the same. Pain didn't have a nationality. The worst cases were already dead or dying. Henri gave them morphine and moved on. The moderate cases, men whose lungs were damaged but still partially functional, he tried to save. Oxygen if available. Upright positioning to help drain fluid. Wet cloths to soothe burning throats. It was all inadequate. The human body wasn't designed to recover from poison gas. Evolution hadn't prepared lungs for chlorine. One young soldier, couldn't have been more than 18, grabbed Henri's wrist as he passed. The boy's eyes were wide with terror, his lips blue. "Am I dying?" he whispered in French. Henri wanted to lie, wanted to offer comfort, but he'd learned that dying men deserved honesty. "Yes," he said gently, "but I can make it easier." He administered morphine, waited for the boy's breathing to slow, waited for fear to fade into chemical peace. By noon, the tent was full, and the overflow had created a field of stretchers in the mud outside. Henri moved among them like a ghost, his hands mechanically performing tasks, while his mind tried to distance itself from the horror. This was what gas did. This was what modern warfare had become. Not men facing each other with rifles, not even the impersonal destruction of artillery. This was something new. Death by chemistry, death by science, death that turned lungs into weapons against themselves. He paused beside a stretcher holding a German soldier, one of the few who'd made it to medical care. The man was conscious but fading, his breathing labored. Through gasps, he managed a few words in German. Henri didn't speak the language well, but he understood enough. "Wind changed," the soldier said. It came back. His eyes held a terrible understanding. He'd helped release the gas, had believed it would kill his enemies, had died by his own weapon when nature proved indifferent to human planning. Henri closed the man's eyes an hour later, added him to the count of dead that was still rising. The gas cloud had dissipated by mid-morning, blown away by the same wind that had created the disaster. But its effects would linger in damaged lungs and contaminated soil, in the knowledge that warfare had crossed a threshold it could never uncross. By evening, the battlefield had gone quiet. Not the peaceful quiet of settled places, but the hollow silence that follows catastrophe. Jakob Brenner's body lay in a German trench where he'd fallen that morning, his chemistry textbook still packed in a footlocker in a dugout he'd never returned to. Friedrich and Otto lay nearby, their final positions suggesting they'd tried to help each other in those last moments. The gas had dissipated hours ago, but the smell lingered. chlorine mixed with mud and death. A burial detail moved through the trenches after dark, identifying bodies by uniform and whatever identification papers remained. They worked quickly, without ceremony. There were too many dead for individual attention. Jakob was placed on a stretcher with 3 other men, carried to a collection point, and eventually buried in a mass grave marked only with a wooden cross and a list of names written in pencil. His mother in Munich would receive a letter 3 weeks later. Standard military notification, regret to inform, died serving his country with honor. The letter wouldn't mention gas, wouldn't explain how he'd died by a weapon his own side deployed, wouldn't describe the wind shift that had turned a planned attack into fratricide. Those details were classified, or perhaps simply too complicated to explain to grieving families who needed simpler narratives about sacrifice and duty. In the Allied trenches, burial details performed the same grim work. Peter Kowalski had survived, his wet rag and quick movement saving him from the worst exposure. But his lungs burned when he breathed, and he coughed up fluid tinged with blood. The medical officer who examined him said he'd live but advised rest, advice that meant nothing in an active war zone. Peter returned to his position that night, sleeping fitfully in a trench that still smelled of chlorine. He thought about the men who hadn't made it out. Jacques, the schoolteacher, who'd promised to help Peter learn better French. Thomas from Liverpool, who'd shared his cigarettes and talked about his daughter back home. They'd drowned in the same gas cloud that had killed the Germans who'd released it. The irony was too bitter for Peter to process. He simply existed through the night, grateful and guilty in equal measure. Henri worked for 18 hours, straight before his commanding officer ordered him to rest. He stumbled to a cot in a supply tent and collapsed still wearing his blood-stained apron. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by the sounds that had filled the hospital tent. Choking, gasping, the wet rattle of fluid-filled lungs. Even in sleep, Henri couldn't escape the drowning men. When he woke at dawn on April 23rd, the hospital had expanded again. More tents, more stretchers, more dying men. The gas attack had created casualties that would continue arriving for days as men with damaged lungs deteriorated. Some had seemed fine initially, walking and talking, before suddenly collapsing as their lungs filled with fluid hours after exposure. The poison worked on different timelines in different bodies. Henri returned to work automatically. There was comfort in routine, in the familiar rhythm of assessment and treatment, even when treatment was mostly palliative. He changed dressings, administered morphine, held the hands of men who were terrified of suffocating. Some he saved. Most he simply helped to die less painfully. A British medical officer arrived that afternoon to study the gas casualties, to document symptoms and outcomes for future reference. Henri watched him take notes, watched him photograph victims with clinical detachment. The man was collecting data for the next gas attack, for the refinement of chemical weapons that would inevitably follow this first widespread use. War had always driven innovation. Henri understood that, but understanding didn't make it easier to accept. The British officer asked Henri questions about treatment protocols, about which interventions had proven effective. Henri answered honestly. Nothing had proven particularly effective. Men with severe exposure died regardless of treatment. Men with mild exposure usually recovered regardless of treatment. The middle cases were unpredictable. Sometimes oxygen helped, sometimes it didn't matter. The human body was resilient until it wasn't, and gas damage seemed to push people past some invisible threshold that medicine couldn't address. Captain Cross submitted his report on April 24th. The language was carefully neutral, describing the gas release as partially successful, noting the unexpected wind shift, cataloging casualties on both sides. He didn't include his personal thoughts about chemical weapons, didn't mention the nightmares that had started the night after the attack. Official reports required objectivity. Unofficially, Cross knew the attack had been a disaster. The tactical gains were minimal. Some abandoned Allied trenches that were too contaminated to occupy immediately. The casualties were significant on both sides, and the precedent was set. The Germans had used gas. The Allies would respond with their own chemical weapons, an escalation that would continue throughout the war, each side developing more effective poisons, better delivery systems, improved protective equipment. Cross was reassigned 2 weeks later, moved to a different sector. The official reason was routine rotation. The unofficial reason was that someone needed to be held accountable for the Ypres disaster, and junior officers made convenient scapegoats. Cross accepted the transfer without protest. He'd given the orders. He bore the responsibility. The fact that he'd been following higher directives didn't change the fundamental truth that he'd authorized the release of poison gas that had killed men on both sides. Years later, after the war ended, Cross would occasionally think about that morning in April 1915. Would remember the maps in the command bunker, the confidence of the technical specifications, the certainty that wind conditions were favorable. He learned that nature didn't respect human certainty, that weapons could betray their users, that innovation in killing was still killing regardless of the methods employed. He never spoke about it publicly, never wrote memoirs or gave interviews. The gas attack at Ypres became a footnote in history books, mentioned briefly in discussions of chemical warfare development. The individual stories, Jakob's chemistry education turned against him, Henri's helplessness in the hospital tent, Peter's guilty survival, were lost in the larger narrative of technological progress and military strategy. The contaminated trenches were eventually abandoned and left to nature. Over the following months, rain washed chlorine residue into the soil, where it reacted with minerals and became inert. Grass began growing again by summer. By autumn, the scarred earth looked almost normal, though nothing grew quite right in the places where gas had pooled most heavily. Local Belgian civilians who'd fled the area during the attack returned slowly. They found their homes damaged or destroyed, their fields cratered by shells, their villages transformed into military positions. The war continued around them, indifferent to their presence. They adapted as civilians always adapt, finding ways to survive in impossible circumstances. Some noticed that certain areas of their fields remained barren longer than others, that animals avoided specific patches of ground, that well water from particular locations tasted strange. They didn't know about the gas attack specifically. Military operations weren't explained to local populations, but they recognized that something had poisoned their land. They worked around it, planted in safer areas, drew water from uncontaminated wells, and waited for time to heal what war had broken. The wounded who survived carried the attack with them in different ways. Peter Kowalski's lung damage never fully healed. He lived with chronic respiratory problems for the rest of his life, died of pneumonia in 1936 at 48, his lungs too scarred to fight off infection. Henri Duval continued working as a medic until the war's end, then returned to Lyon where he practiced medicine quietly, never discussing his wartime experiences, even with family. Jakob Brenner's mother received his footlocker 6 months after his death. Inside were his chemistry textbooks, some letters he'd written but never sent, a photograph of her he'd carried. She kept these items in a trunk in her attic, visited his grave marker once when travel to Belgium became possible after the war. The marker listed him among hundreds of others, names carved in stone, dates of birth and death, no mention of how they died. Historians would later identify the Second Battle of Ypres, particularly the gas attack of April 22, 1915, as a turning point in warfare. Chemical weapons had been used before on smaller scales, but this was the first major deployment. It proved both effective and uncontrollable, proved that new technologies brought new risks, that innovation in warfare could kill indiscriminately. The immediate military impact was limited. The Allies evacuated some positions, the Germans gained minimal ground, and within weeks, the lines had stabilized again into the same stalemate that had defined the Western Front since 1914. But the psychological impact lingered. Soldiers now faced an invisible threat, death that could arrive on the wind, protection that depended on equipment that might fail. Both sides accelerated their chemical weapons programs. By 1918, dozens of different gases were in use: chlorine, phosgene, mustard gas, each more effective than the last. Gas masks improved correspondingly. The technology raced forward while men died testing each iteration. The war that had begun with cavalry charges and rifle volleys ended with chemistry and industry, with death manufactured in laboratories and deployed by weather forecasters. The trenches near Ypres remained visible for decades after the war ended. Some were preserved as memorials, others were gradually filled in and farmed over. By the 1960s, most physical traces had disappeared, though farmers still occasionally unearthed unexploded shells, rusted equipment, human remains. The land remembered even when people forgot. Jakob's textbooks eventually made their way to a military museum, donated by his mother's estate after her death. They're still there, displayed in a case about chemical warfare development, open to pages about chlorine properties and gas behavior. A small placard explains that these belong to a German soldier who died in a gas attack in 1915. It doesn't mention the wind change, doesn't explain the irony of a chemistry student killed by his own side's weapon. Some stories are too complicated for museum placards. Henri's medical journals from the war were destroyed in a house fire in 1952. Whatever notes he'd made about treating gas casualties, whatever observations he'd recorded, were lost. The knowledge survived in military medical texts, in official reports, in the evolving protocols for chemical warfare treatment. But Henri's personal perspective, his individual experience of helplessness in the hospital tent, disappeared with the journals. Peter Kowalski's letter, the one he'd written the morning of the attack, was found among his possessions after his death in 1936. His daughter had it translated from Polish. It described waiting in the trenches, described the anxiety before an operation he couldn't name. It ended mid-sentence, suggesting he'd been interrupted. His daughter kept it in a drawer, eventually passed it to her own children, a family artifact whose full context had been lost with Peter's silence about the war. The gas cloud that drifted across Flanders fields on April 22, 1915, dissipated completely within hours. The chlorine molecules dispersed into the atmosphere, reacted with other chemicals, became part of the natural cycles that cared nothing for human warfare. But the attack's legacy persisted in damaged lungs, in military doctrine, in the knowledge that warfare had crossed a threshold into chemical killing that would define conflicts for the next century. The wind had changed direction that morning, turning weapon against user, but the deeper change was irreversible. War had learned a new language, spoken in gases and poisons, and the words once spoken couldn't be taken back.